Now, in this discussion, because I am speaking to people who already know a lot about the historical account of the country, as well as an understanding of what it means to be independent, 75 years of India's independence, what I am going to try to retrieve is the unsung heroes. And when I say unsung heroes, I am not going to be concentrating on talking only about personalities or doing a historical retrieval. I'm going to look at more of a theoretical or a conceptual retrieval. What is the story of women who have participated and have contributed to the freedom struggle of India? How is that story or that narrative developed? What are the stories that remain unsaid, and why did it become so? So my main focus in this next 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, that I will try to put together this narrative is not to name them, because I'm sure we are all aware of certain names, we are not aware of certain names, but what is the point of this project, the project of trying to retrieve these stories, and why do we do that? Number of historians, especially feminist historians, have tried to do that in various ways. There are historians who have tried to bring together autobiographies or sorry, biographies, and there are autobiographies that they have depended on. We are all aware of the fact that women have contributed to India's freedom struggle, but it is a story that remains in silence. That is why history is known as his story and not her story. So the idea that you are going to be talking, so therefore when we speak about unsung heroes, it is important to recognize that women have contributed, and their contribution is there, not just women, but there are the struggles of the peasants, the struggles of the Dalits, those who have been marginalized, that remains unsaid. And there are many stories also of regions that remain unsaid. So there is a historical retrieval of stories which are mostly mainstream, which are related to a particular region or a particular, let's say, a particular understanding of the freedom struggle. So it is through various prisms that the freedom struggle is retrieved, and we tend to rehearse, revisit, and keep on it is a kind of repeating or a repetition that we do. And there are many projects undergoing, and I'm not the first person who's trying to do that. In that, I will only speak of one or two stories, mainly of two women. I think that is good enough for us to discuss. However, what I'm going to say is that while we speak of these stories, why should it be about names? Of course, names are a way of engaging with what is known as the politics of presence. That there were people who were present, and these were women who were present. So the politics of presence really means that when you retrieve these stories, you also give a certain understanding that women can be involved, they have been involved, and there is a historical precedent to that. So you are able to bring about an imagery of women who participate. So the politics of participation is also about visibility. It is about retrieving. And I think Azadi Ke Amrit Mahotsav has been emphasizing on this. Tell the stories of women, tell the stories of those people who have not been talked about. I will only speak of one character, one person, but I will just try to lay down the historical understanding of why I'm doing that. Now, it is believed that women's participation in India's freedom struggle began as early as 1817. I mean, Bhima Bai Holkar fighting against British colonial forces, or Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi. Her leadership is well known, and we are also aware of the other names which became later on very, very important, whether it was Sarojini Naidu or Vijayalakshmi Pandit, coming up to Annie Besant and all the others that we have talked about. They have been talked about, they have been discussed, and their participation. So, but I would like to say that women's participation in what we know as the freedom struggle, because freedom, it can be understood in two ways. One is freedom for the nation state, which comes in only through an imagination much later in the day, how you understand what is freedom from British rule, because that has also evolved over a period of time. It is not something that came right at the very beginning. But for women, freedom was fought in two ways. One is freedom from the larger shackles of society, freedom from the ways in which certain traditional or I wouldn't even call it traditional, because I think there are many traditional ideas which are very, very empowering for women, and maybe it is not our understanding or our knowledge of those traditions that we assume that all traditions were bad for women. They were not. So therefore, to understand what was empowering for women, how did they step out of that particular, so crossing the threshold becomes very, very important. How women cross the barriers of home. And therein, there are various stories of women who have crossed thresholds. Kasibai Kanitkar, for example, extremely important story, or Ratmabai's story. There are various stories where women have crossed the threshold of their homes to be writers, to be participating in ways in which it enriched the idea of equality. I wouldn't just say gender equality, but the idea of equality per se. So that was one way of freedom. The other freedom, of course, many of us are aware that women did participate, like I said, as early as 1817. Bhimabai Holkar's fight against British colonial, forces, Malcolm, and defeat, in this guerrilla kind of warfare. Or Rani Lakshmibai, very famously, I think a famous story, hers whose leadership has been outstanding, and who was able to, again, she was considered, I think, even by the British as the most, bravest of military leader rebels. Or Begum Hazrat Mahal, who was again a great freedom fighter, and in Lucknow and other parts. These were stories that we know of, and we have understood that as very, very important. But it is only when Gandhi comes in and he tries to, what Partha Chatterjee says, the way in which Gandhi, in a way, tried to resolve the nationalist question, or about women's subjection, or the way in which women were seen, by having them participate in the larger freedom struggle. Radha Kumar says Gandhi feminized the India's freedom struggle. He brought in women to participate as equals and to be able to be part of the movement, so to say. And there are very interesting understandings around Gandhi as to how he feminized the women's, the India's freedom struggle by bringing in women into the various, and I'm not going into historical accounts of that, but into the various kinds of, let's say, the movements that came in, and they also evolved over a period of time. So the way in which, so if you take a look at his methods, and in the way in which you read Gandhi, most of his methods were those that were borrowed, or in a way, those that were interspersed with the idea of women's equality. And they came in from the homes. They were ways in which women protest, if I may say so, although there are no gender stereotypes to that. But there are ways in which women protest. What are the ways in which women protest? They fast. They are generally non-violent, that they participate, and the way in which they do it through passive ways, and those passive ways are by, the whole breaking of the salt law, or the Khadi movement, the discarding or the sacrifice, all of that. Many, if you try to see, these methods are feminized to a large extent. And Gandhi also, in the figure that you see Gandhi, although he was called Bapu, he had the figure not of a masculinist or a strong leader kind of a look. He had a figure of a very frail person. And there are many writings, especially by his own niece also, which says, Bapu, my mother, like he was referred to as a mother. So the way in which this yin and the yang, the Ardhanarishwar kind of figures that are there within the Indian understanding of how you see both in one, that kind of an understanding was also visible in the way in which women, the national movement was feminized to a large extent by bringing in women. He did say, and one has to be also, I always say that when you criticize a person and you bring in to understand a person, you should do it with the lens of that particular period. Because if Gandhi is going to be looked at now, you can critique some of his things. But I think at that point of time, as a political strategy, he brought in women to play complementary roles. He brought in women to move forward from their homes to participate as equals in the freedom struggle. Therefore, the way in which, and also his methods were non-violent, so it gave women a lot of scope to participate. It provided women who were in the homes to bring out their strategies from within their home to participate. So whether it was breaking of the salt law, there are many situations where women did not come out of the thresholds of their homes, but they broke the salt law within their homes. So how did they do that? They broke salt laws within their homes. They decided that they would not be using the way in which they would be bringing in Gandhi into the homes without stepping out. So Gandhi became a figure which led to a mass movement where women could participate as equals, playing complementary roles, being subversive, yet at the same time keeping the ethos of the culture, which was important, which was necessary, because it is not easy to be completely radicalized or completely subversive. So this was a way in which the cultural aspects and the so-called political aspects could be integrated, and it was not just in one place. You could move from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. Most women found their ways of integrating themselves with Gandhi. They saw him as their natural leader. So in that sense, many women participated in the movement because of the way in which Gandhi gave that clarion call. But however, this is not to say that Gandhi did not learn anything from women. And I would like to believe that many of the strategies that he used were learned from the home. So that is one point that I want to make now within the feminist kind of struggles. Now, the woman that I want to retrieve through this particular, because I think it's difficult to retrieve everyone at this point, I would like to celebrate Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. And whereas Ambedkar, Jinnah, Ramasamy were all critiques of Gandhi, and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay was a critical sympathizer, and she was in that sense very, very close to Tagore. And she decided, while Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay was far more sensitive, she felt that Gandhi was far more sensitive to the rights of women. And she was born in 1903. She was born into a Brahmin family. She was deeply influenced by her mother, and she was married and widowed very, very close, in very, very young, at a very young age. And then she studied in Madras. She married Harindranath Chattopadhyay, brother of the poet, patriot Sarojini Naidu. She was, she grew up within the let's say within the theater kind of a structure, and she also participated and she stood for elections in the Madras Legislative Council, but she lost that. She was a convinced nationalist. You could say more or less in the Congress mode. She was elected to the prestigious All India Congress Committee, and she became better known, I think, by the 1930s. And when she actually, that is what I want to say, that we all believe that it is Gandhi who brought in women, but many people felt Gandhi was influenced by some women to bring in women. And Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay she said, do not restrict the salt satyagraha only to men. She said, let us bring women into this. She's the one who made packets of salt. She started selling them. And I'm using this particular narrative from Ramchandra Guha's writers of Makers of India. He only has a few women there. I completely feel very unhappy about that fact. But this is a story that I'm retrieving from his account. It is not my own retrieving. However, I think it's useful to do this. And she was arrested, sent to jail when she broke the salt law. And in 1934, she also formed the Congress Socialist Party, and she urged the Congress to be more sensitive to their to workers, to peasants, and that's why the Socialist Party. And she became very, very active in that. She also became involved in the women's movement. I mean, there was no such open women's movement, but she kept on lobbying for better working conditions for women. She lobbied for right to paid maternity leave. Who could have imagined that at that stage? She was arrested during the Quit India movement in 1942, spent time in jail. But when India became independent in 1947, she refused to enter formal politics, and she could have got an offer to be a part of it. However, she refused to be a part of it. She decided to work for refugees, and she formed the Indian Cooperative Union, and she was contributing on that. From the 1950s, she started promoting, crafts and traditions. She was busy with that, handicraft broads and all of that. And she helped create and nurture the National School of Drama, which you are all aware of, and the Sangeet Natak Academy, the India International Center. She also helped create all of that. She died in 1988, and she lived through the most part of a century that that completely defines India's freedom movement. I do not know whether all of you are aware of how much she participated and how she did this, but when I read this account in Ramachandra Guha's book, I found it very fascinating that look at the range at which she participated. And it is very important for us to understand that Jinnah, Ramasamy Periyar, and even Ambedkar, they were huge critics of Gandhi. But Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay saw a potential in Gandhi while being a critical sympathizer. And these are very important things for us to learn. How can we be a critical sympathizer? What are the ways in which we can learn and we can, go ahead with it? So, however, I think the more important part of Kamala, please let me know when I have to stop, and I will stop. I think the more important part of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, and I'm going to read out from one of her writings that she has written, and I think it's an important writing. Again, I am taking from Guha's book, and this is from her presidential address to the All India Women's Congress conference in Bombay, 7th April 1944. And she says, although the women's movement, and she uses this term, has fairly advanced and matured, I feel the need today more than ever, and she's speaking, in 1944, more than ever to restate its case because of the continued misunderstanding of its nature and growth by a large number of men and quite a few women alike. The women's movement operates as its integral part of the progressive movement in the broadest sense, and it is not a sex war, or as many of us mechanically are led to believe, for the issues around which it revolves, such as rights of votes, or inheritance, entry into professions, and the like, are an intrinsic part of the bigger issues that we are striving to overcome, the prevailing undemocratic practices that deny common rights to certain sections of society. And to give it any other interpretation is to isolate it from the main current. Is that it is equally erroneous to hold the nature of man responsible for women's disabilities and give the women's movement an anti-man twist. It is the nature of our society which is at fault, and our drive has to be directed against faulty social institutions. It's a very, very interesting and a very progressive way of looking at this issue. And in the way in which she tries to do that, she looks at sexual division of labor at work. She looks at engaging with what are the various activities women can participate in. She looks at, this is 1944. She looks at the right to vote. The speech is very long, and I can share more of that later on, maybe as a piece for the audience here to participate and to look at. So this is the process.
Ma'am, there is no dearth of time. You have 15 to 20 minutes. We would like to listen you more. You can take.
Okay. So then, therefore, I would like to then take up some very interesting points here. I think it's important for us to understand that while you are reading about Periyar, about Ambedkar, about Gandhi, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay is a side story. She's like the side dish, somebody you never talk about. However, if you take a look at the kind of speeches, even it is almost equivalent to what Rabindranath Tagore has done, trying to bring about a certain understanding, saying that, to talk about women's equality is not to be anti-man, and man is not responsible for it. The way in which an indigenous feminism is arising here, which we have lost track of, because we started then bringing out our feminist thoughts from the Western white feminist backgrounds, and we understood it from that perspective. But if you look at the way in which Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay writes and the way she engages with the issue of the women's movement, I mean, how are we to understand our society if we are not able to engage with our own so-called, progressive women? You can call them feminists if you wish to. You can call them women's rights, activists if you want to. But whatever you call them, the way they have retrieved, the way they have looked at our situation, coming in not just from writing, coming in not just from engaging, but coming in from praxis, from action. And that is why we got all our rights handed to us on a platter. and that is, if you take a look at any of the Government of India acts coming in from that period of time, or even at the Constitution, and we do know that many of these ideas actually came in. I mean, of course, I am not talking about Tarabai Sinde. If you want, I could speak a little more about that. I thought today I will just concentrate on Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, but I think it's important for us to engage with writers like her, or activists, or freedom fighters like her. So, what and how do we understand her, and why should she remain a small story? Why is she not the big story? And how does one engage with someone like that? How do you find her in this particular narrative that exists? Now, I will jump from here, from Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay's story, to move to how how the women's movement then engaged with the, I mean, all our rights. If you take a look at our fundamental rights, you take a look at our right to vote, we may be, I think, one of the very few countries which right from the beginning got the same rights for women and men. And it is not without reason that we got that, and we have never questioned as to how gender equality was handed to India on a platter, especially coming from the fact, and everyone will say, well, India has been regressive towards its women. There are traditional practices which have been regressive towards women. However, are all those traditional practices regressive? Do we have an understanding of all the practices that exist in India? Now, take a look at the way in which the cultural ethos of India by Gandhi were used to retrieve certain stories of women to participate as equal. Where is that story coming from? If you take a look at the various regions, at the way in which women have participated, women have been leaders in every sphere, whether it is within peasant movements, whether it is within, taking a look at it from, let's say, from the perspective of tribal movements, whether it is, you could move from, I think there are so many stories that it cannot be undermined, that women have not participated. Another very interesting fact that needs to be seen is that they have also there were 15 women who participated in the making of the India's constitution. Kamala Devi was one of them, and she does talk about a lot of these issues when she examines that, and she says that, and she says, and I read, it is not ideal curiosity or cheap sentiment which shapes the question that haunts and harasses every diplomat like a family ghost. What about India? We may well say everything. For while England continues to hold India in political and economic bondage, the United Nations do nothing short of perpetrating a colossal lie on humanity. India is more than a test, it is a symbol. It is the mirror in which the world sees the shape of things to be. Today, we are witnessing the fantastic spectacle of two warring groups. She means the Allied and the Axis powers, each assiduously claiming to fight for the larger freedom and greater happiness of mankind. It is towards a world which recognizes the right of every nation to determine and rule its own destiny, but in a cooperative world order that the women of India and of the world have to strive for if humanity is ever to enjoy decency, peace, and happiness, and world wars banished from amongst our seasonal pests. So, the way in which it is written, you can just see the language. It is her language that I'm reading out. Before closing, she says, I would like to send my thoughts to those millions all over the world whose homes have been gripped by the plight of death and destruction. And I say this with a lot of what I see a surreal understanding of what we have gone through today, and whose spirits are lacerated by untold suffering, and offer them sincere sympathies. In particular, my thoughts turn to the distressed areas within our own homeland, and I take the opportunity to pay my humble tribute to the various organizations, volunteer corps, and individuals who so selflessly serving to alleviate suffering. I should like in particular to congratulate our Bengal branch for its splendid work in this terrible distress. She is meaning the serious famine during that period in 1943, in which several millions died due to starvation. She says the air is heavy with gloom, the sky rent with cries of pain. Civil liberties, one of the main planks of the conference, under perpetual assault. Women can have real freedom only in a society which will hold to them the sanctity of life and the dignity of labor, a society which will give every child the fullest opportunities for development, enforce and practice those fundamental economic and social rights, and for the benefit of science and culture. And this is how she kind of ends up this particular speech in 1944. However, in 19, when we get our independence, 1950, when the Constitution of India is handed to us, we remain, in a way, the stories of all those women who were part of this, and there were many. I mean, I can name a few more also: Vasanti Devi, Ashalata Sen, Sarojini Naidu, Aruna Asaf Ali, Bikaji Kama, Lakshmi Saigal, Rama Devi Chaudhary. There are many, and from every state there will be many. And I have had so many people who have told me, and we are trying to retrieve the stories for our college too, whether we can bring them all together. When you bring in these stories, you come to know what roles they played, but it is always going to remain a marginal history. It is never going to be retrieved in the way in which we would like to do so, until we start talking about it not only in terms of women's equality, not only in terms of women's contribution to the freedom struggle, but to the larger story. So when you read Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay's speech, you will see it is not just about women's equality. She's talking about the famine, she's talking about workers' rights, she's critiquing the UN, she's critiquing England. It is coming a mainstream story of equality, of freedom, and the way in which she's positioning India, and she's critiquing the Western powers. There is such a lot of courage in the way she's able to engage with that story, and I thought it was a good story to tell you. But going beyond that, I come to another story. So suddenly there is a silence within the Indian so-called stories of women's movements, and it is only in the 1974. Earlier, before that, there are a few movements that are here and there. It is in 1970, and I'm not talking about the social reform movement. I did not want to do a historical account. I just wanted to make a more narrative kind of a understanding around it. Now, in 1970s, when the UN asked India and everyone else, I think in all the countries, to do a report on women's status, that is when certain women who belong later on, Veena Mazumdar, Ratika Sarkar, Fulrenu Guha, and others, they got together. They were known as Daughters of Independence, and they were asked to put together the document. And they all felt, since they were Daughters of Independence and they had studied abroad also, they felt India had given all rights to women. So much, when they studied in England, they had seen many differences. Women got the right to vote much later. But what could India have that, women got the free right to vote, they got the right to education right at the beginning, there was progressive discrimination. So they did not feel that they lost out on anything. They said, how can women be unequal? What should be unequal must be based on class. But they discovered, when they started telling that story, they discovered that there were many issues which were overlapping with gender, with the gender of women. And they discovered that had to do with, again, the silence, women's contribution to work. Right now, if you take a look, and I find it very difficult, to understand how we should be looking at workforce participation. We keep on saying India has the lowest workforce participation of women because we are only looking at formal work sectors or informal work sectors. But if you take a look at women's contribution to work, without looking at income generated, women are participating in all fields, just as it is with gross enrollment ratios. And I know that Professor Pankaj Mittal has done some excellent studies on how we should retrieve that story differently in India. We cannot use the same kind of statistics. If you look at sustainable development goals, you need to engage with a different yardstick for India. Otherwise, the measurements are always going to show us this. So how do you retrieve the story of women's workforce participation? So home-based work, unpaid work, domestic work, they're all contribution. They need not be, and no one needs to really bring about income, but it should be recognized that this is women's contribution and how that can be studied. So that came up. Another point that came up, and an area in which I work and research on, is the fact of declining sex ratio. that women in India have shorter lifespans than men, that in India we are still plagued by something called son preference, and we do not allow daughters to be born, and there is sex selective abortion. That needs to be controlled, and that came up. That sex ratio is a significant indicator of the status of women, status of society. And the government has many interesting programs, and now the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao has made some progress in this area, and you might see some improvement. However, this is again the family that needs to be looked at. What is it that makes families in India choose boys over girls? And why do they see women as liabilities? Is it important for us to retrieve these stories, to be able to tell these stories at home, to celebrate and to say that women have contributed, they have been a part of this process, and it is important. So there is not enough time, and I also don't want to do short snippets of stories. Therefore, I found it important to bring about Kamla Devi's story. In every home, there are stories of our grandmothers, and I'm sure in every home there could be a story of a woman who has participated somehow, somewhere in India's freedom struggle. We should bring on these narratives, and we should be able to tell these stories. We should bring about more research in these areas and then link it up. Until India does not tell the women the story of their own women in a way in which it is empowering for all others, we will not be able to tell the story of Azadi. Because every time we speak about freedom or Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav, there will be a UN report telling us, but you know, yes, the status of women and girls is very low. How can you call it? No country can be free if its women are not free. All those stories. Our women were free. But the fact is, we forgot to tell people that story. And somewhere we kept on saying stories that got repeated. And we always speak of anguish, outrage, unhappiness. But that is also necessary. However, we need to balance it out with the stories of women like Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay. So, and many more. I mean, I've only used one story. So I shall stop here. This is a way of retrieving. I see it as a project. I've just begun with this story, but I am trying to look at all regions in India, and there are many people who are helping me with the project. They are bringing out stories from Odisha, my home state. Stories have also come in from Assam. Stories have come in from Nagaland, from other parts, where we are trying to retrieve. People are telling stories of their own great grandmothers who have participated. Everybody has a story, which are linked to Gandhi. So you have these very brilliant, brave women who have done their own thing. They may have stayed at home, and also these are stories to tell. We need to tell these stories. They are different. They do not have to fall into the narrative of a so-called what we call a Western narrative. It has to be a more homegrown Indian narrative of freedom. Yes, women in India are free. They are free. There are some women who are not free. There are some stories that need to be told, but one narrative is not the only narrative. There has to be many narratives, and these multiple narratives will lead to a better understanding of our own country's history, our freedom, as well as for us to celebrate the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. Thank you very much.